Arlecchino has a major issue. Now don't get me wrong, father looks fine as... Wait, that sounded so wrong. Anyway, father has some glaring issues that might not be visible at first due to the complexity of her kit, but are prevalent enough nonetheless. So let's start with a simple explanation of her kit, and instead of just yapping the description of her kit, I'll try to visually show you how things work. But there are two things I would like to mention before we start. First is the bond of life mechanic, which is basically an HP gatekeeping mechanic, and it appears around your HP bar. And the more bond of life you have on Arlecchino, the more damage she'll be doing. Another thing to keep in mind is her general rotation, which starts off with her elemental skill, swapping to supports and using their abilities, swapping back to Arlecchino after 6 seconds using her charge attack and burst, or vice versa, followed by a normal attack spam for 8 to 10 seconds, and then you repeat the entire cycle. Now, I know most of you didn't register that, so I'm gonna have this rotation on screen while explaining her kit, cause that will make it easier to understand. And I implore you to watch this video fully so that you will have a perfect understanding of her kit. With that being said, let's delve right into it. Starting off with her elemental skill, which deals AoE pyro damage and marks enemies with an X. By the way, her skill also heals, but we will discuss that later. So this X is essentially minor pyro damage over time every 3 seconds, and this damage over time effect has 3 levels, with each level giving you more bond of life. It starts off at level 1 when you do her skill. After 3 seconds it goes to level 2, and 3 seconds after that, which is 6 seconds from the beginning, it goes to level 3. And at this level you can gain the max amount of bond of life, which is 70%. And this brings us to the rotation I told you about before. Her rotation starts off with her elemental skill, which will apply the X mark on enemies. Then you swap to your supports, drop their abilities, and swap back to Arlecchino after 6 seconds to gain 70% bond of life. And the interesting thing here about the bond of life indicator is that it will always be half of how much you actually have. So let's say you have 70% bond of life, then it will only show up as 35% of the HP bar in the indicator. And if you are wondering why not show the full 70% to avoid any confusion, right? Well, it's cause you can get over 100% bond of life every rotation with her signature, and it can go even higher with external factors like Arlecchino's Fatui henchman. So yeah, if you had over 100% bond of life, then where would you even show it on the HP bar, right? That's why it's displayed as half. Now, let's put on our thinking caps, shall we? And understand the significance of that visual indicator. So, if the bond of life indicator is generally half of what you really have, it means you can actually get up to 200% bond of life under favorable scenarios, which don't exist in the game right now as of my knowledge, but maybe a future character might make it possible, like, I don't know, the Pyro Archon? But hey,
that's just a theory. A game theory.
Now that we understand the complex part of her kit, the other stuff isn't as hard to understand. So let's discuss her burst, which is essentially an AoE mini nuke, and it also gives her an additional 15% bond of life. Now let's discuss her normals, which is the last thing in her rotation. So starting from the top of her rotation, once again, you use her skill, swap to your supports, drop their abilities, swap back to Arlecchino after a minimum of 6 seconds, and use her ultimate to gain 15% bond of life. After which, her charge attack comes into play, which acts as an activator to get that 70% bond of life from the skill. And as soon as you get over 30% bond of life, Arlecchino's attacks are turned to pyro attacks, and she also gains a 40% pyro damage bonus. But this infusion is semi-permanent. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you have over 30% bond of life and the pyro infusion, then as long as you aren't using your attacks to hit enemies, your pyro infusion will remain. But if you are attacking enemies, then each attack will consume 5.5% of the current bond of life you have. And that's why I say it's semi-permanent, because in the open open world. If you finish a battle with over 30% bond of life, then you will have the pyro infusion until you use it in another battle or eat food to heal. And speaking of healing, this is where her most controversial passive comes into play. So if you are in combat, then Arlecchino can't be healed by anyone besides herself. And how does she heal herself? Well, that's another effect of her skill. So for the final time, let's start from the top. The battle starts with her elemental skill, which marks enemies with X. Then you swap to your supports. For instance, in a monopyro team, after using Arlecchino's skill, you swap to Kazuha, use his abilities, followed by Penny's burst, followed by Xiangling's burst, and all of this will take at least a minimum of 6 seconds, after which you swap back to Arlecchino. And at this point, the enemy already has level 3 of the dot effect, which is X. So you do her burst to instantly gain 15% bond of life, then do a charge attack to gain 70% more bond of life on top of that, resulting in 85% bond of life. Then you start spamming normal attacks for at least 8 to 10 seconds, after which you use her skill again to heal for whatever remaining bond of life you have, and at the same time clearing that bond of life, thus ending the rotation but also restarting it. And if you have been enjoying the video so far, then a sub to the channel would be prolific. Now, one thing I would like to mention is that at the end, you can swap charge attack and burst, because that will result in higher burst damage due to the 40% pyro damage bonus she'll get. And another thing about her skill, which I didn't mention before, is that you can get that 70% bond of life without waiting 6 seconds, but that would require you to kill an enemy with the X mark on them. And since that will rarely happen in floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss, I consider it like a good secondary effect of her skill. So now that we understand her kit, what major issues am I talking about? Well, I am talking about skill issue. On a serious note, that issue definitely has to do with skill. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you have been listening to what I have been yapping, you'll know that Arlecchino can't heal mid-battle, which effectively translates to either play like a god or get god. In this case, Zhongli. Even though she does have a passive talent which increases her elemental and physical resistance, it's still not enough to prevent being one-shotted or even two-shotted by enemies on floor 12. And another issue is the rigidity of her gameplay. If you mismatch her rotation timings, then either you won't do enough damage or get enough heals to stay alive. And that's why Zhongli becomes a crucial factor in her teams, without which staying alive might be a challenge. Another important issue is the complexity of her kit. Now, even though I tried to make it as simple as possible to understand her kit, I still feel that there are many people who will have a tough time playing with her, especially the casuals, because they won't even understand the kit. And another issue which I don't really consider an issue, but people are still calling out, is the fact that she has special animations with her signature and not with other weapons. I for one don't really care about this, since I feel that's just a typical monetization strategy and doesn't really affect my gameplay much, but it's still worth mentioning. And finally, the most important issue which makes her literally unplayable is the fact that the default wings look best on her with no good alternative.